Chapter 28, Pine Creek. The water subsided, and they climbed the rest of the way up the ravine wall. When they reached the top, Jack dropped into the snow and looked out to his right. A frozen lake twinkled in the early morning light, small drifts of ice floating gradually to the lip of the waterfall, picking up speed and slipping over the edge. For some reason, the shattered ice made him think of his friends, and his happiness at surviving was replaced by a plummeting sensation in his stomach. The lion stepped to a nearby tree, stooped, and snatched up a rucksack that had been lying there. As he threw it over his shoulder, his hood fell backward. There were no ropes of dreadlocked mane. There was no mane at all. As he turned, Jack saw that he was slender, with high cheekbones and gaunt features. His tall frame was exaggerated by narrow shoulders and limbs more slender than any lion Jack had ever seen. He looked half-starved. Jack hadn't believed he was king. Not really. But the illusion of king's likeness ended when the lion spoke. His voice was not the smoky baritone of Aaron Harding, but a high, soft tenor. "Who are you? You're not a local." The second part wasn't a question. He looked Jack over, then shrugged off his rucksack, unclasped it, and rummaged around inside. "Take off your coat," he said. He withdrew a tightly woven blanket and tossed it to Jack. Jack did as he was told, then wrapped himself in the blanket. "Thank you," he said. "I'm Jack. I came here with animal control. We were investigating the murders." The lion shouldered the sack once more, then turned and started walking, indicating with his head that Jack should follow. "Mystery solved," he said. "Any idea what Greenridge wanted with you?" Jack trudged after him, drawing the blanket tightly around himself. It made him think briefly of the fur cloak the horned creature had been wearing. He considered the strange appearance must be some kind of costume. But the word that came to his mind wasn't costume. It was puppet. And although it made no sense to him, there was a strange certainty in the word. He shook his head. We followed him into the woods, my friends and I." He paused, afraid to ask the question, afraid of what the answer might be. "Did you see anyone else?" "No," the lion said. "Why was Greenridge after you?" "He wasn't after me, specifically. He was after all of us." "Trust me, kid," the lion said without glancing over his shoulder. "I know an obsession. Greenridge was after you. Whatever he wanted you for. It's the reason all the other rabbits have died. Did he lure you out here or something?" "No," Jack said. "He was meeting someone. Well, something." The word puppet came back to him. It was a sort of creature, like a bull or something, but dead. Instead of a head, it had a skull?" the lion asked, turning sharply toward Jack, his eyes suddenly intense. "Big circular eye sockets, like a baboon with horns?" Surprised, Jack nodded. "And what did he want? Was he looking for me? Did he say my name?" He took an aggressive step toward Jack. "Think! Did he say my name?" "I don't think so," Jack stammered. I'm sorry, I don't know your name." The lion's mouth worked silently for a moment. Then he gave a curt nod and turned once more away. "Let's get you back." Jack had to jog to keep up, hugging the blanket around himself. "How did you know? That I wasn't a local, I mean." "Your fur," the lion said without looking back. "You haven't been here long enough for your fur to turn white. Never seen a butterscotch snowshoe up here." "Oh," Jack said. Now that he mentioned it, it seemed obvious. He remembered Dixon jerking his arm up against those horrible pelts, exactly the same texture and length, but the pelts had been solid white. They headed down the mountain, skirting the edge of the river. The crunch of their footsteps was the only conversation for a long while. Then Jack built up the courage to ask another question. "The skull creature, you know him?" The lion didn't respond. "He said something about an army," Jack continued. Then the words came back to him. "The red teeth. He said the red teeth were waiting at a gate." "The red teeth are extinct," the lion said. Jack considered this. What had that mole said? The one at the archive. Pitfall was her name. That's right, he said, remembering. King destroyed them. The ones that survived, he chased back to Kersha, but even their own country denounced them. But they're here. The skull creature definitely said the red teeth. That's impossible, the lion said. For the first time, Jack remembered something President Brisk had said. Not Brisk himself, but the horribly transfigured creature he had appeared as under the influence of the key.
Red teeth! Red teeth! Red teeth!
Jack had learned later that the key shows what is on someone's heart. Was Brisk a member of the Red Teeth then, or perhaps sympathetic to their goals? Unconsciously, Jack withdrew the key from his pocket, turning it over in his paw beneath the cover of the blanket. Anyway, he started again, his mind too busy to stay silent. I haven't thanked you for saving me.
Forget it,
the lion said. No, seriously, Jack started again. You risked your life for me. If you hadn't...
I said forget it,
the lion barked. He whirled on Jack, and for a wild moment, Jack thought he might tackle him and took a step back. He felt something plunk to the ground, hitting one of his feet. But before he could react, the lion lunged at the object, scooped it up, and thrust it into Jack's face.
Where did you get this?
He snarled. It was the brass key, which Jack had been absently clutching.
I said, where did you get this?
The lion roared, grabbing Jack by the throat and slamming him against the trunk of a tree so hard snow cascaded from the lowest branches. But immediately a change came over him. Not the kind of change Jack had seen in Maddie or the President, morphing into unworldly creatures. This change was more real, more internal. It was as if the anger and aggression had been replaced by something else, some kind of grim comprehension, like he was seeing Jack clearly for the first time. He looked Jack up and down, his mouth forming words he did not voice. His grip loosened, and he stood upright. Don't drop this again, he said, thrusting the key at Jack. Then he turned, adjusted his rucksack, and continued down the hill. Come on, he ordered over his shoulder. Nonplussed and shaken, Jack pocketed the key and followed. They walked in silence. Jack had much more trouble than the lion in vaulting the fallen trees and descending the rock faces they came upon. They walked across a bed of river-smooth stones, a trickling stream weaving through its center. The lion had to help Jack up the opposite bank. Eventually, the trees opened to a broad valley, ornamented in the pleasant sort of village that belonged on a postcard. A tall steeple pointed at the sky from a quaint white chapel. The windows of a shop declared deli and bakery in big blue letters, the paint beginning to chip away. They saw only moderate signs of life at first. The lights of the deli were on, and Jack espied shadowy figures walking around inside. A plump chinchilla in an apron was sweeping the covered patio of a shop called the Dust Bath. When he spotted them, he stared for a moment, then stepped into his shop, a bell tinkling as he entered. Kind of a quiet town, Jack said, breaking the silence as they moved across an icy parking lot. They're afraid, the lion said. There's a killer on the loose. He looked down at Jack, who now walked alongside him. For the first time, he cracked a small smile. We don't exactly look subtle. This was true, Jack thought. The lion, while he no longer wore a hood, was dressed more similarly to the feral Conway had arrested than to the townsfolk that lived here. He, Jack, was still draped in the blanket, looking, he supposed, like the victim of a house fire. The street connected with a broader road that wound east, up the base of the mountain. Jack traced it with his eyes. It cut between tall trees, curved right, and disappeared behind them. High above, pressing out of the woods like a mask on the mountain's face, Fort Safehaven looked down upon Pine Creek. It looked as big as a castle to Jack, who had only seen it at night, and from too close up to appreciate its magnitude. It also looked very far away. We still have to walk all of that? He asked. Walk? The lion repeated. No, this way. He approached a plain gray building, its small parking lot cracked and potholed, with painted lines that had almost entirely faded. Inside, the lobby was narrow, with a single potted plant to one side and a single restroom door to the other. The shop smelled of rubber and tobacco, and nearly every surface looked as though the dust had become permanently affixed. Country music was playing somewhere in the back, along with the whine of a power tool. Black letters stenciled on the wall behind the counter read, Pucciarelli's Pine Creek Tow. The lion clapped his paw down on a service bell. It chimed loudly. "Yep," called a voice from the back room. "Be right up." Jack stared at the stenciled sign. "Pine Creek," he read out loud. "How can we be in Pine Creek? We never crossed the river." The lion glanced at him briefly, then leaned into his elbows against the counter and looked straight ahead. Jack racked his brain. He couldn't remember ever crossing any bridges. They'd crossed over several fallen trees, but none of them had been bridging a river. The only water he could remember crossing was that damp riverbed with a small stream. How were they now back on the other side of the river? Behind the counter, a door with a porthole window swung open, and out stepped a weasel in blue coveralls. "What can I do?" he started, but he fell silent at the sight of the lion. "What in the name of King Sindle's magical manure brings you to the land of the living?" the weasel asked, wringing his paws in an oil-stained towel. His eyes fell on Jack. "Looks like a newcomer. Bad time for a snowshoe to come to Pine Creek," he said. Then his eyes grew wide, and he looked back at the lion. Hey, he's not part of that whole thing, is he?" "It's a long story, Pooch," the lion said. "Right now we need to ride up to the fort." "Safe haven?" the weasel said in surprise. "You so sure that's a good idea? You so sure they won't just nail you to the wall up there? Haven't you got yourself into enough trouble with them?" "Well, I'm either out of it or I'm in a whole lot more. I killed Harlan Greenridge this morning." The weasel leaned back, his bulgy eyes widening. "You killed Greenridge?" He drummed his claws on the countertop, chewing on his lower lip. "I can't help you. Guilt by association. I got a kid to feed, man." "They won't even know yet." The lion jerked his head toward Jack. "He was trying to kill the rabbit. I stopped him. If I got a little revenge on the side, well, that's just a bonus." "Kill the rabbit?" Pooch said, amazed. "So was Greenridge the one killing all the rabbits, then?" "I don't know," the lion answered. "I don't really care. I need to get the kid back up to the fort and get out of there before nightfall. You got a truck I can take?" The weasel continued to drum his fingers nervously. "I don't know," he said. "I owe you one, I know that, but this is a lot to ask." He seemed to be struggling with himself. "I could lose my shop. Times are tough, you know." "Tough?" the lion repeated. "I've been surviving off hotheads in a snow cave for nearly 6 years, and yes, you do owe me one. Forget about your shop. You're alive because of me." "I know," Pooch said, unable to meet the lion's eyes. "You're right, but if you did what you say you did, you must be out of your mind to go up to the fort." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll take the kid. I'll take him up there without you. How's that?" The lion shook his head. "From this point on, the kid doesn't leave my sight." The weasel let out a long, slow sigh. "All right, Harding," he said. "I'll take you both. I've got a truck out back. Let me get some chains on it and we'll get going." He left without waiting for thanks, which the lion didn't seem likely to offer. "This is far enough," the lion said. The brakes whined, and the truck rocked softly to a stop. He cracked open his door and stepped out into the snow. Jack shimmied along the bench and made to follow, but the weasel made a whistling sound as if to get his attention. "Be careful, kid," he said in a low voice. "Harding's a good guy, but his paws are dirty, you understand me? Folks around him tend to get... well, just be careful." Not knowing what to make of this strange advice, Jack simply nodded and lowered himself out into the snow. They watched the truck make a 3-point turn and start off down the icy road again, then turned themselves and began in the opposite direction. Jack had intended to ask about the lion's name. Clearly he was related to Aaron Harding, but the weasel's final words made him apprehensive, and he held his silence. They didn't have to walk far before they stood at a gate made of naked tree trunks wrapped in black iron. Torch brackets were mounted on either side, but the torches were not yet lit. In the dimming light, it looked ominous.
Hello there!
A voice called from somewhere above the gate. Looking upward, Jack saw an ape in plated armor, the same armor worn by the sentries inside the fort. He was leaning over a railing just above and to the right of the gate.
What are your names and business?
This is Jack Roberts, Harding called up to him. He's a guest here, up until your General Greenridge tried to kill him. Jack thought this seemed a rather aggressive way to start things out. We need to speak to the seated lady immediately, the lion added. The ape gaped at them for a moment, then clasped the radio on his armored shoulder, spoke a few words into it, and turned back down to them.
Wait right there,
he said in a suddenly commanding voice, then disappeared behind the wall. Snow had begun to fall. Jack hugged himself tightly, wishing he hadn't given the blanket back to the lion. What do you think we're waiting for? He asked through clenched teeth. No idea, Harding said, but he sounded uneasy, and he turned to look back down the road. After several minutes of silence, there was a loud clattering, as though something was being removed from the gate, and then a deep groan as the doors slowly opened. The lion moved first, and Jack followed him through the gate. As they passed beneath it, a group of guards approached, then formed a circle around them, guns poised to fire. There was silence for a moment. Then the sound of heavy footsteps. Several guards parted, and a tall figure entered the circle. He came to a stop before them, his large paws balled into fists as he smiled dangerously down at Jack.
You are one lucky bunny,
Greenridge said, looking Jack up and down as if he was a meal. The flare gun looked comically small in his paw. He raised it and fired off a single green flare. Behind them, the gate clapped loudly shut.